A neighbor reaches up to a windowsill. She peers through the gap in the curtains, and then she sees her. Laying flat on her back, completely still, a woman just the day before who had been standing at her front door, watching the world go by. The neighbor feels her hand, and it is indeed cold as ice. For 58 years, no one was punished for what happened to Louisa Dunn. That's longer than most people's entire adult lives. Long enough for a killer to grow old, to build a life, and to become someone's grandfather. Or to sit in a garden in a quiet street in Suffolk and believe with every passing decade that they had truly gotten away with it. This is a story of a 75-year-old widow murdered in her own home in the summer of 1967. It is a story of the longest cold case ever solved in British history. And it is the story of what happens when silence catches up with evil, no matter how long it takes. Louisa Dunn was born Louisa Jane Jarrett in 1892, back when Queen Victoria was still on the throne. The world she was born into and the world she lived in could not have been any more different. She married twice. Her first husband, Teddy Parker, was a prominent figure in the Bristol socialist movement. They had 2 daughters together, Iris and Edna. Teddy died in 1945. Louisa later remarried a man named John Dunn. He too passed away in 1961, and by 1967, Louisa was 75 years old, twice widowed, living alone in a terrace house on Britannia Road, in the close-knit neighborhood of East Bristol. She was known to her neighbors. She was a constant fixture on the street, often seen at her front door, watching the world go by. Her next-door neighbor would leave the daily paper out for her each morning. She walked to the shops. She chatted with people she knew. She was quite private, but warm. She was also, by all accounts, security conscious, and her neighbors even said that she didn't open her windows. On the night of June 27, 1967, something woke a bus driver named Sidney Gibbs from his sleep. His house backed onto Britannia Road. He couldn't say what it was that woke him, just that something did. A few minutes later, his young child woke up screaming. Unusual for her, he settled her back to sleep and thought nothing more of it. His neighbor, Harold Hudson, was also awoken that night. His dog had stirred, and then he heard it, a sound he later described to the police as a frightening scream. An adult woman's voice, followed by what could only be described as moaning, then silence. The next morning, Louisa did not collect her newspaper from the garden wall. Her neighbors noticed. On a street like Britannia Road in a community like Easton, you did notice these things. One neighbor climbed up to the sash window. It was open, and that alone was alarming. Louisa never opened her windows. She peered through the curtains and saw Louisa laying on the floor, motionless. She climbed through the window and felt her hand, and it was cold as ice. Louisa Dunn was found flat on her back in her room. There were cuts around her chin, bruising on her neck, hemorrhaging in her eyes. The cause of death was strangulation and asphyxiation. She had also been sexually assaulted and robbed. A neighborhood's worst nightmare had become a community's trauma. The investigation that followed would last in one form or another for the next 58 years. When the police arrived at Britannia Road that morning, what they found was both horrifying, crucially, and evidential. A palm print left on the rear window of Louisa's home, the window Headley is believed to have used to break in. Traces of sexual residue on Louisa's clothing, including a blue skirt she had been wearing at the time of the attack. In 1967, this was significant evidence, but it was also evidence that science simply wasn't capable of fully exploiting yet. DNA profiling didn't exist, fingerprint databases were in their infancy, forensic analysis of biological material was limited compared to what was coming decades later. What the police could do, they did, and in the weeks and months that followed, they undertook one of the largest investigation efforts in Bristol's history. Investigators collected palm prints from approximately 19,000 men and boys in the area. They compared every single one to the print found on Louisa's window, and unfortunately, there was no match. In 1967, Ryland Headley was 34 years old. He was living in Bristol at the time of the murder, and if you passed him on the street, you would have no idea. But Headley had a pattern. 10 years after Louisa's murder in 1977, Headley was convicted on 2 counts of rape. His victims were elderly women, aged 79 and 84. He had broken into their homes overnight and attacked them the same way he had attacked Louisa, a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable and elderly women who lived alone. He was initially sentenced to life imprisonment for those 1977 crimes. On appeal, that sentence was reduced to just 7 years, and he only served approximately 2 of those. He was released and went back to living his life. The judge who sentenced him in 2005 would later describe this pattern as a chilling pattern of behavior. Headley had shown across decades a complete and deliberate predation towards elderly women. He knew what he was doing, and he chose his victims very carefully. And yet, for all the time, the connection to Britannia Road in 1967 went unmade. For the families left behind, especially Louisa's granddaughter Mary, those decades were not a period of silence. They were a period of waiting, wondering, and grief. Cold cases have a particular cruelty about them. The crime doesn't fade for the people closest to it. What fades is everyone else's attention. The case files go into boxes, the boxes go into storage, and the world simply moves on, while the family carries something that never will leave them. This is the weight Mary Dunn's family carried for most of their lives. But thankfully, it would not last forever. By the early 2000s, the science of forensic DNA had transformed criminal investigation. Cold cases that had been impossible to solve were being cracked wide open. Biological material that had been stored in evidence bags for decades was suddenly viable. The question for cases like Louisa's was simple: did anything survive? The first possibility investigators feared was that the 58 years simply hadn't been kind to the biological material covered from the crime scene. Biological evidence degrades, improper storage destroys it, and many cold cases from the 1960s have indeed hit this wall. The evidence exists on paper, but the material itself is comprised beyond use. For years, this was a genuine risk hanging over Louisa Dunn's case. Without viable biological material, even the most advanced forensic technology in the world can't help you. The second scenario that the material survived, a DNA profile was obtained, but there was no match in the national database. This is the outcome that haunts cold case investigators the most. You have a profile, you have a killer, but until their DNA enters the system through arrest and a conviction or a voluntary submission, you have nothing actionable. This was a real possibility. Headley had stayed out of serious legal trouble for decades after his 1977 convictions. If he had ever been rearrested, never been added to the national database, the profile would have sat there unanswered, perhaps forever. But then came 2012. For reasons unrelated to Louisa Dunn's murder, Ryland Headley's DNA was added to the national database. A door had just been quietly unlocked. The Avon and Somerset Police Major Crime Review Team opened the boxes. In 2023, detectives from the Major Crime Review Team went back to the stored evidence from Louisa Dunn's 1967 murder. They cataloged what remained, and what they found was remarkable. Louisa's blue skirt, the one she had been wearing the night she was attacked, had been preserved. In May of 2023, it was sent for advanced forensic testing, the kind of testing that simply didn't exist back in 1967 or in 1977. The results came back. A full DNA profile was obtained from the fabric of that skirt. And when that profile was run against the national database, it matched Ryland Headley's. The forensic scientist's conclusion was precise and unambiguous. The DNA recovered from the skirt was 1 billion times more likely to belong to him than to anyone else on Earth. And then the palm print, the one left on Louisa's rear window all the way back in the year 1967. The window the attacker used to break in, it had been stored with the rest of evidence for nearly 6 decades. 4 independent fingerprint experts examined it and all four of them reached the same conclusion, that it was indeed Ryland Headley's hand. On the morning of November 19th, 2024, officers arrived at a house in Clarence Road, a quiet street on an ordinary house, and inside they found a 92-year-old man who was of course Ryland Headley.
Come in, please.
No, you can't come now. I'm just coming now. Where you want to come in for?
I'll explain, Mr. Headley.
Yeah.
Ryland Headley, lovely. Thank you very much. This is my colleague Joe. We've just got a camera recording as well, just for you. I need to do this.
Wait, they get very honest. Come on.
Appeared at Bristol's magistrate's court via video link. He confirmed his name, his date of birth, as well as his address. He was remanded in custody after 57 years. A man had been finally brought to account for what happened on Britannia Road all these years later. The trial of Ryland Headley began at Bristol Crown Court in June 2025. The man, who had been 34 on the night he broke into Louisa Dunn's home and killed her, had denied everything. The prosecutors, led by Charlotte Ream, laid out a case built on two pillars: the DNA evidence, that 1 in a billion match, and the palm print confirmed by 4 separate experts. They had also introduced what is known as bad character evidence. Headley's 1977 convictions for breaking into the homes of elderly women showed a pattern, showed history, and it showed a man who had done this before. He had done it first in Bristol 1967. The prosecutor told the jury Louisa Dunn died in a horrifying attack carried out in a place where she should have felt safest, her home. For 58 years, this appalling crime went unsolved and Ryland Headley avoided justice. The defense challenged the reliability of DNA evidence stored over the decades. They questioned chain of custody and raised doubts. The jury deliberated for 9 hours and 53 minutes, and they ultimately returned with their verdict: guilty. He was found guilty of both rape and murder. On July 1st, 2025, 58 years after Louisa Dunn was found cold on her floor, Ryland stood at the dock in Bristol Crown Court waiting to be sentenced. Now 92, Judge Derek Sweeting looked at him and said that Headley had shown a complete disregard for human life and dignity, that he had exploited Louisa's vulnerability, that he had subjected her to a pitiless and cruel act, that she must have experienced considerable pain and fear up until the moment of her death. And then the judge addressed him directly: "You will never be released, you will die in prison." Ryland Headley was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. Louisa's granddaughter Mary was described by the senior investigation officer as showing remarkable resilience and courage through the investigation and trial. She had waited her whole life for this, and she finally got a name, a conviction, and a sentence. There's something extraordinary and quietly devastating about this case. The science that solved it, the DNA technology, the advanced forensic analysis simply didn't exist when Lisa was killed. The original investigators did everything they possibly could, and yet the answer was always there, sitting in an evidence bag, waiting for the world to catch up. It took 58 years for the world to catch up, and when it did, a 92-year-old man on a quiet street in Suffolk learned that time is not a shield.